All right. Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our session today. Hopefully you've had a nice day in Las Vegas. My name is Kenan Owens. I am a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Microsoft, focusing on System Center, mainly on Virtual Machine Manager and Hyper-V. With me is Fahad Ahmed. He's an infrastructure architect at the Chicago MTC. And today we're going to walk you through, on the data center side, configuration, deploy, and how it relates to the private cloud within Microsoft. It's mainly going to be focused on, in this session, VMM with some Ops Manager we're going to talk a little bit about as well. It's going to quick talk on Config Manager, but not a lot on there. So if you think this is a Config Manager session, it's not. You're welcome to stay. We'd be glad to have you. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about System Center 2012 itself and how it interacts and allows data center administrators to better configure and deploy both their infrastructure components as well as the private cloud infrastructure. Now I'll talk a little bit about the difference between what I mean about those two things. So this is a slide that you're probably going to see every once in a while in a couple of the decks, and it kind of frames the talk about where we see different pieces, both the infrastructure deployment, and the infrastructure management, service delivery and automation, as well as application deployment. Where we're going to focus today is what's on the right side of your screen there. How do I get these machines up and running? How do I get this virtualization environment created? How do I create the private cloud environment to be used? And then we have a session following on this FIB 312 that's going to focus more on the monitor and operate. After I have this infrastructure created, what do I do to get the most out of it as it's been running over time? So inside of here, what we're focusing on in the private cloud is how do I take these underlying diverse set of infrastructure and build the private cloud from there, or build the foundation for the private cloud, that then the other sessions, when they're talking about the service delivery and automation and the application deployment and the application performance management, those things can take advantage of this infrastructure you create. So I have many different types of servers in my environment. I have, HP, Dell, IBM. I got Intel, AMD servers. I have many different types of hypervisors. And that's that middle layer right there. On the bottom layer, I got different types of storage. Maybe I got fiber channels attached storage. I got SCSI, iSCSI. And I have a complex networking environment. How do I take that and build something that's both, one, logical and standardized, and two, dedicate or share these resources between the different organizations? Maybe I have a development environment and a production environment. I want to take this pool of resources and build it into something that then I can give out to my infrastructure users or my self-service users. So how I do that is I create, from this diverse set of infrastructure, a logical pool of resources that I can then create these clouds. And a cloud is just a container that allows me to allocate specific sets of resources. Those clouds can be dedicated to specific pools, or they can be shared across multiple. I can have multiple clouds sharing the same set of resources. Once I have these clouds created, this delegation, I can now start adding in resource utilization. I can add in users that can then access and use these resources I've created. And it's important that when I create these user roles and delegate this capacity, that I have control over what types of resources they can use and how they can use them. And then once I've given them access to this cloud, I can then standardize what kinds of services they can deploy within the cloud. This gives me control in that I can give them the ability to provision all they want, but only of the types of resources that I allow them to provision. This allows me to get IT out of the way in some respects so that these application owners can deploy these resources when they need them. As you may have seen in the keynote today, Ryan requested resources and then was able to deploy them himself, instead of having an administrator have to do that and spend all his time deploying services instead of making his operation inside his data center run more efficiently. So that is the fabric for the private cloud, basically. That's your infrastructure that you're going to use to give off and start building the capabilities that really extend the private cloud with your service delivery and automation and your application performance management. So we're going to talk about those bottom layer. How do I manage my infrastructure components? If I look at my infrastructure components, the main things I'm looking at there are compute, storage, network, and then bringing them all together into a cluster. And we're going to focus on that. How do I take my different hypervisors, my different types of computers, bring them together? How do I manage the storage environment that I may or may not own? And then lastly, how do I bring this complex networking environment into something that's simple for my application owners to use? Bring it all together, and that becomes the private cloud infrastructure.
And just to add there, sorry, what you saw on that slide, the last slide there, we're actually going to go into demo of each one of them, actually most of them. So this session will be very demo heavy, so you'll get to see most of the things we talk about here as well.
Exactly. So when we're talking about bare metal deployment or managing those compute resources, one of the things is System Center has a config manager component and System Center has a virtual machine manager component. When do I use which of those, and what happens when I'm using things like VMM to do bare metal deployment? So within System Center, we do have these two pieces. For your physical servers, you're probably going to use config manager if that server is just running a straight OS. It's not virtualizing anything. If I'm going to use Hyper-V, I'm going to use VMM to deploy those servers, and also the virtual machines that run on top of them. So what we've built inside of VMM is the ability to manage your physical hypervisor machines, your Hyper-V machines, as basically an appliance. That's the way you would want to deploy the OSs on it, manage the baselines, do your updates, your controlled updates on those systems. And you would use config manager to deploy your standalone Windows Server type environments. You would also use config manager for your baseline patching type environments where I'm doing just standardized baseline patching to these systems. But managing the underlying physical Hyper-V systems, I'll use VMM for that. So how does VMM do that bare metal deployment? So who here was in the keynote, saw VJ kick off the bare metal deployment before he went swimming? A few of you? Okay, great. What happened actually under the covers that we were seeing in the background of that video is the following. Once you've gone through that wizard and you say, hey, deploy a brand new machine, the first thing we do is we talk to that baseboard management controller and reboot that physical machine. We boot it up. It does a pixie boot. The first thing it does after we tell it to reboot is it talks to a WDS server in your farm. And that WDS server then would authorize that MAC address of the machine, and it would then pixie boot that machine, sending down a WinPE image to that machine. So when the machine boots up, it pulls down the WinPE image from VMM, or from the WDS server that was given to it by VMM, and boots up the machine. After the machine's booted, it then runs any type of generic command execution scripts you may have built inside of the WinPE image to do things like format the hard drive or those types of things. Then what it will do is it will take the machine and it will communicate now with the VMM server to start downloading a VHD file. So when we do this bare metal install via VMM of a Hyper-V server, that machine will then take and download a VHD file, and it will then start booting from VHD. So the VHD image will have the Hyper-V role enabled, and it will boot from inside of there. It also injects any drivers. So if this is an HP system, you have a smart array adapter or something like that on the physical system, or it's a Dell system with a special driver for a NIC or something like that, it will inject those drivers into that system if you had any special drivers you wanted downloaded and installed on that system. It will also do just the standard discovery and set up the machine that way. But if you have any special drivers, it will inject those into the system. And it's downloading both the VHD and the drivers from your VMM server library, which would either be on your VMM server or on a library server in your VMM farm. After it injects those drivers and does the boot from VHD, it'll boot the machine up, do the sysprep stuff. Then it will go and it'll connect to the domain, join the domain, and enable the Hyper-V role. And after it joins the domain, enables the Hyper-V role, it reboots, and at that point, it's now part of one of your host groups, whichever one you decided at the beginning to set it at, and it's a Hyper-V server that you then do whatever configuration needed to be able to add it to a cluster. So when we do the bare metal deployment, it has the OS installed, booted up, it's Hyper-V role enabled, it's part of VMM. The next things that you'll have to do are things like create the logical networks or attach it to the logical networks that are in your cluster if you were going to do the drag and drop into the cluster. You don't have to worry about the storage. It'll do that stuff for you. So we'll show you some of that in a few minutes. After we've done the OS installation, one of the other things we have to manage is the storage. And we talked a little, VJ showed some of that when he clicked on the classifications, and then he clicked on the Dell compellent storage. Let's tell you a little bit about what that works like. Well, we do a few things with storage, and why do we do some storage management? We're not going to replace your existing storage management tools. What we're going to do is enhance it for when you're using it for a virtualized environment. So by using the SMIS protocol, we can do things where you can create an end-to-end view of how those particular VHDs you have deployed are connected to which VMs, which are connected on which Hyper-V hosts. So you have that view, but you also have from the LUN side, this LUN has these VHDs, and it goes all the way back through to this storage controller, through this worldwide name, that type of thing. So you can build that end-to-end mapping of how the storage is connected to your physical servers. The other thing we can do is that you can manage how quickly you add storage capacity and how you manage your storage capacity. Instead of having to go to your storage guys every time you need a new LUN or every time you need to add a new virtual machine, you can say, hey, give me a pool of storage, and I'll be able to allocate it to the different hosts and the different virtual machines as I see fit. So it'll decrease the amount of time it takes to deploy and to add new services if you need them. And then lastly, if you're doing things like I need to deploy out 1,000 virtual machines or something like that, we can leverage the storage technology to either snapshot, clone, or whatever, those LUNs that are out there, to really do things like rapid provisioning of virtual machines within your environment. So what are the things that we do with storage allocations? The first thing is, by leveraging the SMIS provider, we can discover the different pieces of storage that you have out there. So you may have an SMIS provider for your EMC systems, another one for your NetApp systems, another one for your Dell compellent, and it would be able to discover and manage those different storage environments. And we do that because we'll all be talking the SMIS 1.3 or 1.4 version. Then after we've discovered this storage, we can create these different classifications. Classifications are good because what that means is that if I have a tier 1 and tier 2 classification, like in this demo here, I mean in this slide, the tier 1 storage could be made up of different types of storage. In other words, I may have NetApp servers as well as my Dell compellent in the same classification, but depending on where those things are attached will depend on which storage gets sent to those virtual machines. So I have a host group, and that host group is iSCSI over here and is talking to my NetApp servers, but I have another host group over here that's talking to Dell compellent. If I have a virtual machine that says install on tier 1 storage, I can install it on either one of them, and it'll just choose the appropriate storage for that virtual machine to be deployed upon. So the classification gives me the ability to set up these delineations of how the storage is supposed to be viewed, which allows me to better manage who gets access to what. After I've created these classifications, I assign them to particular host groups. And this allows me to, by allocating this capacity to that host group, I can then start using it to create new LUNs and attach them to different Hyper-V hosts. Okay, so I've allocated it, then I can assign existing LUNs to Hyper-V hosts. So if that storage pool that I was given had a LUN or two in it already, I could assign them to Hyper-V hosts. It'll handle the masking and the unmasking or the connections via iSCSI to that host. Or I can then create a new LUN, and then I can assign that to a Hyper-V host. And I can do this across different host groups or whatever. So I have the ability now within VMM to allocate the correct amount of storage to the correct environments. Now, we go really deep into storage later on this week, so if you have any questions on that, I'd go see that. But one of the things that we do also perform here is that if those LUNs were existing and we didn't create them within VMM, if we tried to delete it, it wouldn't delete it. We'd only delete the stuff that we can create. So you do have protection there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to flip over to a demo, and Fahad's going to show you this infrastructure management.
All right, thank you, Keenan. So what I have here is my VMM console. Under the VMM console, what I have selected here is Fabric. So this is where all my fabric management takes place. So as we talked about this morning, what is fabric management? It comprises of the servers, network, and its storage. So under my storage, I have a few arrays. Now, just like what Kenan said right now, this environment is it's not just on a one box. It's a full-fledged enterprise-level environment. I have it running on 8 nodes, HP and Dell both, EMC and NetApp storage, Brocade fiber channel in the back. Every time I added a new node, every time I added a new server, I went over to my EMC architect right there and bugged him and said, hey, I need some more storage. Hey, I need some more storage. And he was getting really annoyed. So he gave me the SMIS provider into the EMC storage that gave me the ability to manage my own storage and create my own LUNs, and also with NetApp. So what I have here under classifications is I've created Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 disk storage pools here. So out of that, I'm going to create a LUN. I'm going to select my aggregate, call this MMS production CSV, because we're going to create a CSV out of this later on. I can assign it, for right now, we'll give it about 100 gigs of storage. And we'll create one more on a separate aggregate. And we'll call this MMS prod witness disk. We're going to need that later on as well. And we'll give it 2 gigs. So what I just did right now is I created a CSV LUN that we're going to use to assign to our cluster later on. And then we're also going to need witness disk for our cluster. So as you can see here, I have my prod CSV LUN, and I have my witness disk. Now if I go back to my servers, this is where all my production servers reside. So I have 2 nodes under my production host group. I can assign the storage that I just created to my host group. So I just click on storage, allocate logical units. And as you can see, my LUNs show up here. So I'm going to add that and add this. So 100 gigs and 2 gigs. Now we see under our storage, we have 102 gigs of capacity for this host group. And that's it. That's all it took, right? I don't have to go to Ryan anymore for him to assign these storage to me.
And the other thing is right now, they're assigned to the host group, not to any individual host. So we'll be doing that later.
Yep.
Awesome. So you've seen how we've been able to create the storage and get it ready to be used. And this makes it simple for you as an administrator to then go in and create the storage as necessary, add it to the host as necessary, and we'll show you how easy that is in a few minutes. The one last piece, we talked about compute, we talked about storage. The last piece is networking. How can I make it simple for my end users who don't know anything about VLANs or don't want to know anything about the different VLANs, the different IP addresses and the ranges, and give them an easy way of accessing network? Well, with Microsoft, we have this thing called CorpNet, and everybody calls it CorpNet, and that's just the main network that we always use. So I wouldn't want to say, okay, you have to have the 10.3.17 network. Instead, I'll just say connect to CorpNet, and everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. Oops. So within VMM, we allow you to abstract that complex networking and give you something simple to give to your self-service users. So we do a couple of things with the networking. We create logical networks, this logical mapping between the physical and the virtual networks. We create these things called address pools. So again, every time Fahad needs to create a new VM, I'll bet he has to go to the network guy and say, hey, can you give me an IP address so I can assign it to this virtual machine? Why can't I just say, hey, give me a pool of servers, a pool of IP addresses, and I'll statically assign them to my VMs? This allows you to get this pool of IP addresses and create static IP mappings in your VM. So when the VMs boot up, they boot up with not DHCP, but a static IP address. Yet you don't have to know exactly which IP address goes to which machine. The other thing is I have load balancers. If I'm creating a multi-tier application, which most applications are today, inside those applications, my front end usually is put behind some type of load balancer, an F5, Microsoft NLB, Citrix, or something like that. Well, why can't I use VMM to connect to those load balancers and set up the routing rules or the load balancing rules inside of that load balancer for that service that I'm deploying? Just makes things a little easier if we can do all this together. So within VMM, we have these things called logical networks. And how does a logical network work? Basically, if we take this logical and standardized infrastructure that we have, and where I may have some complex networking in one environment, simplified networking in a different environment, within VMM, I can just create this one thing called DMZ as a network label, or another one called prod. And I can assign them to the different physical adapters as I see fit. So when I add a Hyper-V host, I click on which logical networks it's going to use for which NICs and which virtual networks. That makes it easy for me to say, this is DMZ, this is prod. Now a service that my end users have created, whether that service is in development, where the development network is a very flat network that only has like maybe 2 networks inside of it, or it's in production, where I may have 500 VLANs that are spanned across different things, depending on which data center, which building, which floor you're on. I can create this service template that says, use the DMZ network and use the prod network, and it will just automatically attach to the right networks, depending on where that VM's deployed. So that service in dev gets attached one network adapter to DMZ, 2 of them to prod. Inside production, I have multiple services. They get deployed that same way. And this last service that's deployed to my other data center, all of it is set up and working flawlessly. So I don't have to worry about which adapter, which Hyper-V server adapter, which VMware server adapter I connect to. It's just going to automatically connect to the right adapter for me. So when I put all that stuff together, it makes it easier for me to deploy these services out, because we do things like create IP pools. An IP pool is this pool of IP resources that Vijay was talking about earlier today, where I may have these different networks, but the pool of addresses are the ones that I can assign to the different services and VMs as they get deployed. Of that IP pool range, I can specify a piece of that to be for my virtual IPs, for the load balancers, and I can also take those virtual machine IP pool or IPs and reserve pieces inside there that are for maybe statically already created machines that are out there. Think about IP addresses in our IP pools. We assign them. They're stuck to that virtual machine until you delete that virtual machine. So what that means is that it's not going to, every time it reboots, get a new IP. It's going to have the same IP assigned to it. And then just, when you delete it through VMM, it'll return that IP address back to the pool. Same thing with MAC addresses. We can create virtual MAC addresses for your virtual machines so that when they come on the network, they're going to have the statically assigned MAC address that's the same. When I live migrate it or whatever, that MAC address is going to stay with the VM. And we will check that out at host creation when I create the VM. And then when I delete it, it'll return it back to the pool. Now, virtual IP pool is a subnet of an IP pool, a subset of an IP pool. And that virtual IP pool is used for your load balancers. It has information as far as what's the load balancing method it's going to use and those types of things as well. But it's assigned to the load balancer when you deploy a service that needs to talk to a load balancer. Speaking of load balancers, we support now ones from F5, Brocade, and Citrix, as well as the Microsoft Network Load Balancer. What we do with them is, whereas in storage, SMIS protocol had a set protocol and all these different vendors wrote a provider for that SMIS protocol, there is not a common protocol for load balancers. So unfortunately, we had to write a provider for each of these different, we worked with the partners to write a provider for each of their different load balancers. And what that means is that we can now create these virtual IP templates that allow us to manage and configure the load balancer when we deploy a service. So I can create the F5 provider, or I can use the Citrix provider, or the Brocade provider. And when I deploy a new virtual machine service that needs access to a load balancer, it will connect to the load balancer, and it will assign the main IP address, as well as how it's going to route back, whether it's going to be round robin, next available, those types of things. So it'll set that stuff up for me, so I don't have to now go back to the network guys every time I deploy a service and say, hey, can you do this? Can you set up the load balancer for me? And then lastly, once I've configured all of those, the compute, the storage, the networking, put it all together, I now can create my cluster. So here, within VMM, I don't have to now go to Failover Cluster Manager to create the cluster. I don't have to go to Hyper-V Manager to enable, or to the role manager to enable the Hyper-V role. I can do all of these things inside of VMM. So we have a wizard-based experience that allows me to take these systems, choose what they are to create the cluster. We will mask the storage to those systems. We will allow you to choose which storage you want to mask, whether you want to enable CSV or not. We will also allow you to add new nodes to that cluster. And when you add a new node to that cluster, we'll mask the storage for that new node. Or if you evict a node, we will remove the mapping to the storage for that cluster. And then lastly, if you want to delete that cluster, you can do all that. So we can do the whole thing for cluster management inside of VMM for your Hyper-V environments. So let's have Fahad show you all that.
All right. Thank you, Keenan. Excuse me. How many of you have created cluster using Cluster Manager? Quite a few. All right. How many of you thought it was a painful process? A few of you. All right. We'll make your life easy. I asked because I meet customers almost every day. I do architecture designs for customers, put all this together for them. Almost all of them tell me that, how do I do it, right? You know, am I going to Hyper-V first, and then I'm going to set up the network after that, and then I'm doing Cluster Manager? Is that when it pops up? We'll make it so simple for you, you won't believe it. Let's check it out, all right? So I have two nodes under my production, Hyper-V 01A, Hyper-V 01B. I've already discovered them. But let's say if I did not discover them, all I had to do is right-click and say, add a Hyper-V host or cluster. I could do Active Directory domain, use elevator privileges, do Active Directory query, and just like that, if I wanted, I could add this node to my cluster or add this node to VMM. All I'm doing at this point is just adding a host that I have provisioned or I've created into VMM. That's how I discovered the other two that you saw on the console. We're not going to use C at this point, but all I wanted to show you is how do you discover a host inside of VMM. All right, so now we have our two nodes here. We're going to create a Hyper-V cluster. We're going to name this MMS prod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Give it elevator privileges. Here's asking me which host group are they in. So if you have servers that are in different host group, you just move them. Just right-click and say move to a different host group. They just have to be in single host group. So here I just add them. Now, if you remember in Cluster Manager Wizard, it also gives the option to do cluster validation. We do that too. Inside of VMM, you can also do cluster validation test after you're done creating a cluster. To save some time, we're going to skip it, but we definitely recommend that when you create your clusters, definitely validate them. I just assign it a cluster IP address. Now remember all that storage that we created earlier? It becomes available to me here. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the available storage to shared storage. So I have 3 disks that are available to me. I have my EMC disk that's assigned to me. I have my NetApp disk that's assigned to me. And I have my witness disk. Now, what you notice is we will automatically pick the smallest disk for the witness disk, right? Now, the minimum requirement for a witness disk is 512 meg. Here I'm going to do quick format, and I'm also going to make this a CSV. I don't need to make any additional steps to make this a CSV, just a little checkbox. If I have any additional logical networks, those will show up here as well, so I could add them as well. That was it. Just like that. Much easier than before? Definitely, right? My customers think so too. Now, we want to make this session interactive. I also got with me some Xbox Live Gold membership. Quick question for you guys. Let's see if you can answer this. Just raise your hand and I'll have you come up to the mic. Which storage vendors do we integrate with? Anybody? You're right there. Which storage vendors do we integrate with?
So far, you've got NetApp, EMC, HP, and Dell.
All right. Almost there. I'll give it to you anyways. Anybody with the SMIS provider. All right? Here you go.
So SMIS 1.4 or 1.3, 1.4 what
Thanks
we
for being
require. Now, we've tested with HP, Dell, EMC, NetApp, and a few others. So as we have them, we have the different storage vendors that we've tested with. But anyone with an SMIS provider, we can connect to.
Yep.
We haven't fully tested every one of them out there yet.
And we'll come back and I'll show you guys once the cluster is completed. It doesn't take long at all. As a matter of fact, if I go into jobs, it's about 69% complete right now.
Here, click back on it and click on details real quick.
Oh.
A question?
Yeah.
Are you doing zoning on the lot, sand, behind the scenes there, automatically?
So the question is, are we doing zoning on the LUNs? No, we're not doing zoning on the LUNs. We are doing masking on the LUNs. So we're masking that LUN for that IP, I think is the right terminology there. I'll have to ask the EMC guy there. But we don't zone the switch or anything to allocate that. You'll have to do that outside of VMM.
Another thing to keep in mind, if you're going to make any changes to any storage inside cluster or anywhere else, if VMM is going to do anything to the storage, VMM must be managing that storage, right? So I might have a disk that's presented to my host, but it may not be being managed by VMM. So it won't be able to create clusters, CSVs, and all that stuff. So little tip I learned over the last couple of days.
The other thing is that one of the things you'll notice in the jobs, it's over now, but there was a parallel tasks. So things were happening at the same time. So it was doing masking for all those different pieces of storage to the server 1 and server 2 at the same time, not one at a time. There was a question over here on the left.
I can't hear. Could you speak a little loud?
Are those two disks presented to Hyper-V hosts? They were not presented to the Hyper-V host before we did the clustering. When we did the cluster creation, it then talked to the storage vendor through the SMIS provider to mask that LUN to that host. There's a question over here. Uh-huh. Cluster manager to do it. So the question was, if I have this 2-node cluster, right? So if I have this 2-node cluster and I want to add a third node to the cluster, do I have to do it through VMM, or can I also do it through failover cluster manager? I would recommend you do it through VMM because VMM then will do all the masking and unmasking. If you do it outside of VMM, then you have to go in outside of VMM and mask the storage. So you have 2 of them that were masked by VMM and 1 that wasn't, and things could get a little strange if you tried to evict that node. So I would recommend doing your cluster management of your Hyper-V hosts through VMM. There was an existing LUN. The third LUN was a LUN that was already assigned to it by the storage guy. So we already had a LUN assigned to each of those hosts. Fortunately, it was assigned to both, so the cluster could still be created. If it was only assigned to one and not the other, then things would get weird. VMM could still evict a node from that type of environment, but it won't unmask that third storage from that node that it would evict because it doesn't manage that storage. Is there a question more over here? Right. Okay, so that's a great question. That leads us into some stuff that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. So I'll table that for a second. Actually, no, I'll answer it now. The question was, it shows you a lot of stuff you can do with Hyper-V. Can I do all this stuff with VMware? No. You can do it similarly with VMware, but with VMware, you have to do it through vCenter.
Yeah.
So we manage the other hypervisors. We manage the virtual machines and things on the other hypervisors. We don't manage the other hypervisors.
We don't do the fabric management of those hypervisors. But a point to note is, and I'll show you guys later too, any investment that you've already made in your vCenter, so if you created your vSwitches and data stores, once you add your vCenter servers into VMM, all those things automatically show up inside VMM. So you don't need to recreate them. Any clusters you created in there, any, like I said, data store, vSwitches, all of that, and we'll see it in a second. And we'll take some more questions in a second. I know we have a lot to go through. All I wanted to show you here is that we were able to add these disks here, and also our cluster nodes got created as well. So
basically, the next thing, and we'll just move to it right now in the session, is I manage this underlying physical fabric. So now I want to start managing the fabric on top and start building this private cloud infrastructure that my folks can use. So that's where we go now, is to the what are the things I need to do. So we talked about in the configure and deploy the infrastructure components, how I manage my physical and virtual compute infrastructure to deploy a bare metal deployment of an OS and to add those nodes inside of VMM. The storage management we talked about, the network abstractions through the logical networking, and then using cluster brings it together to now have that foundation to create a private cloud. So now we're going to talk about what do I do once I have these clusters created, whether they're a Hyper-V cluster or maybe I have a VMware cluster that's already out there. How can I do things with that to make my life easier? And that's where using things like abstraction allows me to create this cloud abstraction of those physical resources. Whether it's a Microsoft or a VMware or a Citrix Xen server environment, I can do cloud activities upon them, and we'll talk about that. I want to control who has access to these clouds and what they can do with those clouds, and that's what the last two sections are here. So first thing is you want to build a private cloud your way through abstraction. You want to make sure that the resources that you have, when you build this cloud abstraction, it uses the amount of resources you want that one particular pool to use. So everybody here who was at the keynote saw VJ create the cloud in about 30 seconds. And I mean, it's really that easy to build the mapping between the physical resources that you want to use and the clouds that you create that then you can deploy your virtual machines within. So how do we do that? We basically just walking through the wizard, create cloud, and you saw it. I mean, it's just 16 clicks to get through it, basically.
We'll show it in a second.
What?
We're going to show that in a second.
Yeah, we're going to show it in a little bit after we go through this next piece. The next option is we know that you don't just have Microsoft Hyper-V in your environment. And you want to be able to manage your Citrix, your VMware, your Hyper-V at the virtual machine level the same way. So what we're saying is that you have these virtual infrastructure, the hypervisors installed, configured, but you want to be able to deploy a service, whether that service is deployed on VMware, on Hyper-V, or on Citrix. I can do the same activities, the same tasks. I can manage them the same way. And that's what we build within VMM, is this consistency around how we manage the virtual machines on top of these heterogeneous hypervisors. So what we do is we allow you to abstract this hypervisor level, and the people that are deploying VMs basically can just say deploy VM, and then we'll take care of where it gets deployed and how that works. So basically how we do that is, well, if you have this host group, the host group can be made up of Hyper-V environments, or we can add a vCenter server, and we can add vCenter or ESX VMs inside of there, or it can be Citrix Xen server. And we can create different host groups of one environment or multiple environments in the same host group. If we saw on the demo stage, we had a host group called production, and that host group had 2 ESX clusters and 1 Hyper-V cluster all within the same host group, which means that I can set host group level policies, like for dynamic optimization, and it applies to all those different clusters. Then if I'm deploying a service instance, I could deploy that service instance to a Hyper-V environment, could take that same service instance, replace basically what VHD it's using, and deploy it to my Citrix Zen server environment. Or I could take that same service instance, and maybe I can say one tier wants to deploy to Hyper-V, another of those tier wants to deploy to VMware, and I can deploy a tier of service that crosses or spans across multiple hypervisor environments. We can do that because what we do above the service level, above basically what VMDK, VHD file you're using, is the same across all those different platforms. So if I want to deploy a service and it has to domain join, it has to add all these different roles and features, and then it has to install this MS Deploy or SQL DAC pack or Server App V package, that's the same whether the underlying hypervisor is Hyper-V, VMware, or Citrix. So I've created this service template that I can use. I've managed these hypervisors, but now I want to delegate access to this private cloud. So what we allow you to do is create these things called user roles. And the user role allows me to determine how much and of which cloud resources that an individual can use. So an individual user role can have access to one cloud or multiple clouds. And in each of those clouds, I can set limits on capacity, how much of those cloud resources I can use. I can also specify for the user role what kind of actions that user can perform, start, stop VM, those types of things. By pulling that all together, I now control what types of resources are available and who has access to use them. So what we're going to do now is Fahad's going to come on and show you those different pieces inside the demo.
So first what we're going to do is show you real quick how to create a cloud. So we're going to call this cloud MMS Lovers. So I have a cloud dedicated to you guys. All right. Here I can select what resources are allocated to this cloud. So we're going to assign maybe my fabric management, or I can also assign my developers host group. Now, something to notice, if you have already created VMware resource pools, you can also assign those here as well. So I only have one resource pool in VMware environment. So if I wanted to, I could assign that as well. So in our case, we'll say fabric management. Any logical networks that you created, you can assign those here as well.
So these logical networks are the ones that are assigned to hosts within that host group. Yep. So if I didn't assign it to the host in that host group, it wouldn't show up in that screen.
Any additional storage that I might have assigned to this host group? I don't have any additional storage to that host group right now, so that's why you don't see it. Now here's the thing, capacity. I know you guys all love private cloud and want to go crazy, but I do want to keep it a little limited. So I can say you can have about maybe 30 CPUs, and you can have unlimited memory. I have tons of storage, so you can have that. And you can have maybe 30 VMs that you can create. So you give me some limitations, some boundaries that you're creating within this cloud. Now I can also put a limitation saying that this cloud can only host Hyper-V or ESX or Citrix hypervisor.
One of the things about a capability profile there is that maybe I want to be more of an offering type of environment to my end users. So I could create maybe a gold, silver, and bronze type capability profile where a bronze is 1 virtual CPU and 1 gig of RAM, and I could just assign specific types of virtual machines instead of the different hypervisors. So I have a lot of different choices there on how I want to set that up.
Yep. And here I have my ESX environment also. So my ESX cluster is a 2-node cluster. So as you can see, I have a server running here, finance app, that I deployed last night. if I go back to my ESX environment, as you can see, my finance app server shows up here. If I go into a ESX node, into configuration, you see my data store that I've created here, my networking vSwitches that I've created here. They all show up inside my VMM. If I go back, Fabric, over my networking. My vSwitches show up here, so I can assign these vSwitches to appropriate resources if I wanted to. Now let's see how we create or assign delegation rights inside VMM. So under user role, I'm going to create a new role. All right. That's right. All right, I'm going to call this MMS ops. Now here I can add another administrator to that cloud. I can give somebody read-only rights to that cloud, or I can delegate a self-service user inside a cloud. I can add who gets to have rights to it. So I have an operator. His name is Ricky Bobby. All right, so here I can assign different clouds. So I'm going to give him rights to Traders Cloud because we just created the MMS levers. There's nothing in there. Now here's a cool thing. I can assign under this group how many virtual machines this user can create. So we'll say 10. This group can create. But individual users cannot go more than 2 VMs. So I can have delegation rights for the cloud or for the group, and then I can also delegate limitations and rights for individuals. Does that make sense? And then I can do similar thing with the CPU and memory. So one particular person does not take up all the resources that are assigned to that cloud.
So one of the important things to remember here is that I have those 3 levels of delegation: the cloud level, the user role level at the group and individual user. What most people will do is they'll create a limited number of clouds, those top-level clouds, usually either by location or by function, sales, marketing, or whatever, or test and prod, that type of thing. But they're not going to create 150 different clouds. What they'll do is they'll fill it out with user roles, and those user roles will assign the resources of the clouds to the individual user roles. That's what we've seen most of our TAP customers do. Obviously, your mileage may vary depending on how you want to set it up.
So here I can assign resources that Ricky Bobby has rights to. So what I want him to do is monitor and manage my 2 application servers. All right. Now, as you can see here, I have all my templates here, and I can give him rights to some of the templates. And then I can define the actions what Ricky is allowed to do. I need him to be able to deploy VMs on demand, but I don't want him to go crazy and deploy any kind of VMs that he feels like deploying. So what I'm going to do is say you can deploy VMs from the templates that I've created already. So I have created templates that say Windows Server Standard Edition. It comes with 2 gigs of memory or 4 gigs of memory and 1 processor. Similarly, our customers might choose to create a SQL template, a web server template that has all the assigned
So this is where you can maintain control while your self-service users get the ability of speed and not having to wait for you to deploy the machines for them, but they're only going to deploy instances that you've created for them.
I can allow him to have a elevator privilege run as account and finish. So that's how easy it was for me to create a user role inside of VMM. Any questions regarding that? All right. Now what I'm going to do,
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so the question was, I saw vSphere 4.1, what about vSphere 5? Well, with the GA release of System Center 2012, VMM 2012 only supports vSphere 4.1. We're working on that for a future release. So what our goal is that with the next release that we're working on to support Windows Server 8 to have that in there. So the release of System Center that comes with support for Windows Server 8 is the one that we hope to have the latest version of vSphere supported. I'm sorry, what? This is VMM 2012. This is VMM of part of System Center 2012, yeah. GA release.
All right. As a data center admin, I can have a look and I can have visibility into all the clouds. Now, Ricky Bobby is not a data center admin. So we're going to log in as Ricky Bobby into App Controller. You saw a glimpse of App Controller this morning. So this is a power user or an operator or a business unit IT person who we've given rights to. As you can see on top, we have Ricky Bobby signed in. And you can see that Ricky Bobby only has access to the Traders Cloud. You also see that we have not deployed any machines, and I show the limitation that I can only deploy 2 VMs inside there. I see the virtual machines that I've given him rights to, and all the actions that he has access to. So he cannot shut down or pause or save or store all of that, but he can turn off, or if a machine was turned off, he can start up the machine.
That's real safe. That's just hard to turn off the machine, right? So you have the ability to set those different actions inside of the user role within VMM 2012. So, oh, there was a question over here, and then I'll get you. So there's a whole session on that, I believe, Thursday afternoon about the future of self-service. But yeah, that's with System Center 2012, what you would use for your VM deployment and stuff. There is the existing self-service portal that's in VMM 2008. We've brought it forward to 2012, but only for backward compatibility. So it doesn't have a lot of the new capabilities that VMM 2012 provides, but it does allow you to still use that for this version. But that's not going to be enhanced over time.
The question was, does the app controller places SSP in VMM?
Emerging best practice, don't allow users to use stop because of the...
Right.
Yeah, so best practice, give them shutdown capability, but don't give them stop or power off capability, unless you want to get that phone call, why is my machine turned off? But then again, you want to be able to stop it if it crashed or something like that inside the VM. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just beware. Don't just give them stop for sure. The other thing is once those VMs are deployed, they can obviously RDP into them or whatever, the way they can normally access them. But if you want them to use the VMM console, we'd recommend for App Controller for your users, but they could also use the VMM console logging in with that user role. If they do that, they won't even see that Fabric workspace. They will only see the clouds, the VMs and services and clouds one. All right, so we've created these environments. We've built this private cloud. We've given users access. We've told them which templates they can use, but we want to build some control around those templates. We want to ensure that they only use the services or the VMs that we've given them permission to do or to access. And to do that, we can then make it easier for them to deploy their applications because we can build these service templates that have all of our integrated infrastructure apps that we have already deployed on them. And we can also do things like deploy an entire multi-tier application through this thing called a service template. So a service template is made up of multiple, or I should say one or more tiers of VM templates. Each tier is defined by a VM template and represents one or more virtual machines. So I can have, say, a standard 3-tier application. I can have a web tier, an app tier, and a data tier. That web tier would have a VM template for the web environment, which has things like what does that, how much memory, how much RAM, what VHD OS image to boot off of. And then also, if I want to install on a web tier, I wanted to have, say, an MS deploy package so I could just deploy that web environment. It can do that for me as well. The application tier, again, has a different VM template that has all the VM, VMDK, if it's a VMware environment, VHD, Microsoft or Citrix Zen Server environment, hard drive, has the configuration, OS memory, that type of stuff, as well as if I want to add an application on top of that. In other words, if I want to deploy a server app vPackage or something like that to deploy the application. And then the same thing with the database tier. So on the data tier, you got two options here. You got the ability to deploy SQL and do the SQL DAC stuff inside a VM, or if you have an existing SQL server that's out there and you want this to just add an instance and add a SQL database into that instance, it can do that as well. So that tier could be either a physical machine or a virtual machine. And they're built together so that I can deploy this environment, and then I can choose a cloud to deploy to, and it'll deploy to the resources on that cloud. Some of the cool things here, I could make each of these tiers deploy one or more virtual machines, and those tiers, per tier, could be deployed to a different hypervisor. So I could have a template for Zen servers being my web front end, for ESX being my middle tier app end, and for Microsoft Hyper-V being my back-end database. If I wanted to, I could have this multi-hybrid type application. Or I could have all of them on Hyper-V or all of them on VMware or Zen. So what we're going to do now is show you the creating a VM template process and how that goes through using VMM 2012.
Service template. All right. How many of you have seen the Stock Trader app? Stock Trader app?
Couple.
Oh, very few. All right. So what I have here, it's a little bit zoomed out. Let me zoom in a little bit more. All right. So what I have here is a 4-tier application. I have a web tier, order processing tier, application tier, and the database data tier. As you can see in my template, I have the OS settings in there, and I have my hardware settings in there, and then I have my application settings in there that tells the template exactly what to do with that application. Am I deploying an application? Am I deploying a web server? Am I deploying an app vPackage? What are the dependency on that application? So rather than when you have this 3-tier or 4-tier application, rather than you taking the request first to the web team, then to the data team, then to the storage team, we built a service template so you can deploy that holistically and also be able to monitor that and view that holistically, right? So when I deploy this application, Stock Trader app, that entire app gets deployed inside my environment. So I have, if I go in my traders, when I click deploy, all 4 servers, or let's look at the services. So I have my Stock Trader service here that I deployed last night. And as you can see, I have my SQL tier, my web tier, my order processing tier, and so forth. Now if I open it up, I have one machine here that is running 5 database. I have my web tier that is running 2 web servers, and then I have my application tier, order processing, and that's running 1 application in there as well. Now, if I switch back to my template, so if I deploy this service, I can also set threshold on the web tier, saying that if the utilization starts going up, I need you to start scaling out. I need you to start deploying new server, similar to what you saw this morning, this morning's keynote session. So the way we do that is inside the template, I have scale out rules set up here. This tells it exactly how to deploy it and what the scaling out rules are going to be. Now, if I zoom out, how many of you think this thing is super complicated to put together? I mean, it's obviously a complex service, right? So I'm going to show you exactly how to make this happen. Close this. All right, let's come back to my library. Inside my library, I have templates and I have profiles. I have my VM templates that I deploy virtual machines. And then I have my service templates. Now, The VM templates and service templates consist of different profiles. So I have my application profile. In there, I have two applications, a trader logic and a stock business order processing application. And then I have my SQL Server profile that has the rules to deploy a SQL Server, right? Why are we doing it this way, right? This is the modular approach to service deployment. You can have your application group package the app, develop the application, package it, and supply you with that application. And you can create a profile for that. You can have your database folks create the DAC files for the SQL and give you the appropriate configuration for the SQL Server deployment. And you can build that in there. Once I have created my SQL Server deployment profile, every time I'm deploying a service that requires a SQL Server, all I have to do is apply that profile to that template. And it's not very hard to do that either. So create a SQL Server profile. I'm going to call it MMS prod, SQL Server configuration. Here I can add a SQL Server deployment. We'll call it MMS prod deployment. I give it an instance name, instance ID, give it a run as account. I can give it some more run as account. And I can tell it where the media source is. Hold on. Any questions regarding?
So he's creating that because what happens now is then after we deploy the virtual machine, the next step is to go and deploy SQL on top of that, and it'll go connect to the directory here and pull the SQL media from back there. Yeah. That's correct. This is all being done through VMM. It's not being done through the configuration manager client to install this application.
Server administrator. Didn't I give you one?
So then the other things to be aware of when you're creating these different VM templates and you're creating the profiles that go on top of them, you can create a VM template and then you can add a profile. Or you can then take whatever you did in creating the VM template and save that as a profile. So I can save my hardware profile. I can save my OS configuration profile. I can save my different application profile schemes.
All right. So these are pretty familiar settings for anybody who deploys SQL Server. So all I did right now is created a SQL Server profile for deployment. I do the exact same thing for application deployment. And I have these two created already, so we'll use that. We're going to create a new service template from scratch. We're going to make this a two-tier app. We're going to call it MMS prod. I can give it versioning here.
So one of the cool things here is when you're creating this service template from this pre-created pattern, it actually gives you these multiple tiers, and they already have some things pre-filled out. You can just change them how you want. But also on the left over there, you have the ability to drag and drop individual VM templates if you want, or you can specify each of the different profiles inside of the template.
So I just created a two-tier service template, and I dragged and dropped the VM templates that were already created. All I need to do is add application to this guy. So this is going to be our application tier. So under application configuration. Now I can create a VM with all those settings built in, with application built in, with SQL Server built in, all of that built in. But the reason I choose to do it this way is if there needs to be a change made to application, all I need to do is just make that change to the application profile rather than the entire VM.
Go ahead. Are there any plans to integrate SharePoint? There's a whole session on creating a service template out of SharePoint today, or I don't know if it's today, this week. So SharePoint, because of the way it manages underlying, talks to the physical hardware and stuff, or talks through the OS, is not a perfect candidate for Server App V, this release of Server App V. So we're working with the SharePoint team. Pieces of it you can already do. Other pieces you need to do custom work on the side. So there's a whole session on creating a service template for SharePoint later this week.
The SQL deployment profile that we created, we can add it here. So essentially what we end up with is a two-tier application, two-tier service template that lets me deploy an application and also lets me deploy a database as well. Now, if I wanted to, I can add additional databases to it. Now, what if I need to change the network? I can just click here and move over to .49, and all my NICs change over to 49.
So there you're assigning which logical network that this virtual machine is going to be deployed to.
Yep. And if one of these were a web tier, I could also add a load balancer here as well. And that's just pretty much a click here and click there. So I just select this and configure the web traffic and connect this to the logical network. And that's all it takes to make that happen. Now, if I want, I can add additional logical networks. If my application needs to talk to two different networks, I can bring that here, connect these two guys together, and make this one .50, right? So now my application tier talks to both 50 and 49. That's all that took, you know. I don't need to go in there and crack open the image or crack open the VM template.
And then once you finish creating this template, you just basically right-click on it, say Configure Deploy, and it'll go in through a deployment wizard that allow you to choose which host and which cloud you want to deploy to or a host. And at that point, you can give it any type of special parameters. One of the cool things about service templates that we do, there are two things that I think are really cool about templates. The first one is we can do things like add roles and features in the service template. So when I deploy this thing, I don't have to, after I'm finished deploying, go log in and add the feature .NET 351 or whatever. I can set it up in the template, and it'll automatically happen for me. The second thing is that I can create interdependencies between the different app tiers. So I can give it replaceable parameters that at deploy time, when I deploy this instance, I can fill in things like this VM has to talk to this SQL server, not the old one that I used when I deployed the thing initially. And it'll inject that into the application, either through the pre or post scripts or through the application virtualization server app V package, and it'll just inject it into the application. So those are some really cool things. And doing services templates this way is a new thing. So your developers are probably not going to be familiar with how this thing works. When they're going to want to deploy an app, they're still going to want to do it the old way. And it's going to be a parallel effort for you over time. But they're going to start seeing the benefits of how quickly I can deploy things, how I can set these parameters around those applications, that you're going to be building your private cloud, and at the same time, they're going to be starting to rebuild the way they do applications. So what we've talked about today is really how do I take these underlying disparate pool of physical resources and move them to create a private cloud and build that foundation that I can then use for getting the efficiencies of operation that I get through service delivery and automation, the application performance benefits that I get with the application management that we do for the private cloud. And we do that by handling these heterogeneous virtualization environments and abstracting these resources and controlling how much and of what type of access those self-service users can do. So what we've done today is take this physical, diverse infrastructure and walk through to build that private cloud capacity. There are a lot of sessions. This is kind of like the kickoff point. There are a lot of sessions over the next week that go into all these things we talked about in much, much greater detail. I think Fahad has a question maybe to give off something.
Yeah. First question. Was this helpful? Does this make sense what you guys saw and heard? Cool. Now, quick question, raise your hand. From out of what you have seen today and from previous session, give me 2 things that this allows you to do that you don't currently have. Anyone? You don't qualify. 2 things that this allows you to do in your environment, in your data center. Somebody volunteer?
The self-service provisioning and development environments?
Yep. Second one? All right.
Quicker to roll out apps?
Second question I have is, out of what you've seen, are there any pain points that you currently have in the environment that this alleviates? Something, a pain point in your environment, something you're not able to do, or it's a constraint in your environment that if you were, go ahead. Easily creating clusters. Amazing. Yep. That's yours.
All right, so we're going to be around for the next few minutes to answer questions. I know that it's going to lunchtime, so we really appreciate your time today, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.